Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope that this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners, and I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. Now, let's get into these current events. Multiple suicide bombings occurred during the Easter services at several respective churches and upscale hotels in Sri Lanka. The devastation killed 359 people and injured another 500. Following the tragedy, ISIS claimed responsibility for the massacres, but Sri Lankan government officials are still investigating the incident, but believe that another terrorist group known as NTJ is responsible. There's very little information regarding the group holistically because they are believed to be relatively new. And before the attacks, the group was only linked to vandalization incidents of Buddhist statues in Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan officials also believe that because of the massiveness of these bombings, the group had to have had outside international help in order to help carry them out. Before the attacks, there were warnings given to officials that the attacks would occur, which prompted Sri Lankan police on high alert and in fear that NTJ would bomb prominent churches in the area. While the police chief sent an intelligence alert because of the warning, the health minister claims that the prime minister and others were completely blind on the situation. Yet tensions concerning status between the prime minister and president are believed to be partly the reason that the two had communication errors concerning what was then a possibility of attack. While Sri Lanka is no stranger to bloody violence, as evidenced by their country recently ending a multi-decade civil war, there's absolutely no excuse for any government officials of any institution to have knowledge of a possible terror attack and not implement safeguards to protect its citizens and foreigners alike. Rightfully so, citizens are enraged at the lack of precautions that weren't taken to prevent this from happening. Sri Lankan Prime Minister responded that he and other government officials hadn't been warned, and if they would have been, there definitely would have been safety measures put in place. While there are assailants in custody, the investigation is still underway to bring all appropriate people to be held accountable for this tragedy. Globally, there's so much happening that often gets overlooked for varying reasons. This, along with other experiences and occurrences, deserve the fullest attention, no matter the status that country or state has. It's also important to note that intelligence flaws happen in countries all over the world, especially in the U.S., where intelligence communities are not particularly well integrated and crucial information seeps through the cracks. This is what happened when red flags were misplaced or ignored by key officials leading up to the 9/11 attacks, the worst to ever occur on American soil. This is why executives must trust and fully understand their respective intelligence communities in order to ensure that all briefings are fully read and given adequate support instead of denying their legitimacy, i.e. Donald Trump. Another current event I want to highlight is a few days ago, Houston, Texas hosted the first ever presidential forum solely focused on women of color and issues important to them. She the People is a national network that connects women of color to transform our democracy by elevating the political power and voices of women of color. Started by Amy Allison, a Stanford grad and one of the first women of color to be honorably discharged from the U.S. Army, Allison hopes to propel the often forgotten voices of women of color into the political spectrum. She also founded and is president of Democracy in Color, dedicated to empowering the multiracial progressive electorate through media, public conversations, research, and analysts.
When I talk with women of color in my own life, they'll say, wow, that Elizabeth Warren has great plans. She's got specific plans. She's got great ideas. But there's a fear in a lot of people of color and a lot of women of color that say, after the experience of 2016, they don't have the confidence in the electorate of this country to elect a woman president. They want to vote one way, but their fear says that they may need to flee to the safety of a white male candidate. How do you address?
I think that's called side-eye.
I'm just telling you.
Side-eye.
How do you address people who are not confident? They're not confident the country is willing to elect a woman. How do you address people who may be interested in voting for you, but may be afraid?
So, let me just say this about confidence. You bet. Look, this is the heart of it. It's how are we going to fight? Not just individually, but how are we going to fight together? Are we going to fight because we're afraid? Are we going to show up for people that we didn't actually believe in, but because we were too afraid to do anything else? That's not who we are. That's not how we're going to do this. Here's how I see this. I'll tell you how I see it. We got a room full of people here who weren't given anything. We got a room full of people here who had to fight for what they believe in. People here who had to reach down deep, and no matter how hard it was, no matter how scary it looked, they found what they needed to find, and they brought it up, and they took care of the people they loved. They fought the fights they believe in. That's how they got into these seats today.
STP hosted this forum alongside 8 Democratic presidential hopefuls and invited a multitude of women across the country to ask questions and gain more insight on the candidates to figure out, why should we vote for you? The candidates there included Beto, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders, Julian Castro, Tulsi Gabbard, and Amy Klobuchar. Elizabeth Warren was by far the star of the event after receiving a standing ovation. Attendees and women around the world watching appreciated her specificity and thoroughness of her responses, especially in regards to the questions she received concerning maternal mortality among Black women. Warren detailed her plan to combat the increasing maternal mortality rate in the U.S., along with her plans to eliminate student debt. Castro received a warm reception as well for the same reasons as Warren, and for his detailed plan to protect people of color from the increasing epidemic of gentrification and for property tax relief. Candidates who received a mixed reception from audience members were Sanders and Gabbard, being that Sanders didn't talk much of his policy plans or wouldn't specifically reference the issues women of color face, and instead lumped marginalized groups together when speaking on issues. Gabbard, who has faced a lot of deserved criticism because of her past views on the LGBTQ community, did say that she wanted to repeal Trump's transgender military ban, but holistically, the audience wasn't buying into it. Meetings like this are few and far between for women of color to be present at and given the opportunity to vocalize their concerns and opinions regarding policy and issues that are important to our respective communities. Obviously, we have to start somewhere. But it's so often that women of color are pushed to the side in the political, cultural, and social sphere of our society. And that just has to change because we aren't going anywhere. Our issues aren't going anywhere. We have consistently been at the forefront of catalyzing concrete change in history and in modern times. These candidates, alongside others, are very in tune with that as well, which is why the question, why should women of color vote for you, should warrant a damn good and authentic response from those running for these positions, because our votes do matter. Now, let's get into this week's episode. Our country has had a long history of domination by for-profit corporations with a self-interested view dating back to over 150 years to the Industrial Revolution. Initially, this was seen in banks and railroads, but today, it's the large tech corporations of Silicon Valley that we interact with every day, such as Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. We'll begin with the largest, Amazon. Although it began in 1994 as an online bookseller, Amazon today has expanded to not only selling books, but honestly anything you could think of buying, in addition to creating their own technology in the Echo and Alexa, Amazon Web Services, which is one of the largest cloud computing platforms on the market and makes a huge chunk of their coins, and even acquiring Whole Foods. Due to this large and expansive grasp on the consumer marketplace, it's unsurprising that in 2018, Amazon became only the second corporation to break $1 trillion valuation, and Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, is the richest man in the world with a net worth of around $160 billion. Although he's about to lose some of these coins because his wife is set to receive half of his net worth once their divorce is finalized. Maybe he should have gotten that prenup, or maybe he shouldn't have cheated on her. But anyways, and he has his own private rocket company on the side. Despite all of this, Amazon paid $0 in federal income tax in 2018. Yep, you heard me, zero. 0 coins were given in federal income taxes. How did this happen? Y'all's President Trump. In the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the Trump administration lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. In addition to this, Amazon was able to use certain loopholes, which will be explained in this audio clip.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is passed.
First, there's the tax bill. President Trump's signature tax legislation lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%.
Corporations are literally going wild over this.
That immediately slashed Amazon's potential tax burden. Then there's Amazon's savvy use of revenue. Amazon plows large portions of revenue back into itself to cultivate long-term growth.
Amazon has actually been self-funding for several years now. The company generates significant free cash flow. You know, one of the things I like about Amazon is this is a company that doesn't really kind of rest on their laurels and is constantly trying to innovate, is constantly trying to meet the needs of the customer.
This started early on, with Bezos using the strategy to get big fast, helping Amazon eclipse its once arch-rival, Barnes & Noble. Since then, it's helped Amazon gobble up countless other retail markets as well, embark on lucrative ventures like Amazon Web Services, and even become a Hollywood studio, with shows like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and Jack Ryan. Amazon has invested so much revenue in itself over the years that sometimes it didn't even make a profit, and when that happened, it could carry forward losses to write off on future tax bills. In 2018, those carry-forward losses eligible for federal write-off amounted to $627 million. Then there's massive federal tax credits, which the company reports are primarily related to research and development. From its AI-assisted logistics network to its suite of consumer electronics products, Amazon has poured tens of billions of dollars into research and development over the years. But that's not the only tax credit Amazon qualifies for.
The big one last year was the expensing that is allowed for investments in plants and equipment and buildings and things of that sort.
Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act supercharged this credit, a perk that Amazon has cashed in on. The idea behind the expanded credit?
The big problem with the U.S. economy is that it has not been as productive recently as in the past. And so one solution, which would help sort of companies everywhere, is if they invested more in machinery and training to make their workers more productive.
But not everybody buys into this reasoning.
The tax breaks Amazon is getting, they're being rewarded for what they were going to do anyway. Because when you're a company as successful, as profitable, as cash rich as Amazon is, you make investments when you have the money to do them and when you see the need for those investments.
In 2018, Amazon had about $1.4 billion in total available tax credits. Finally, there's the company's use of stock-based employee compensation. Basically, this allows Amazon to pay employees using stock and then take the value of that stock off their tax bill.
Amazon rewards its employees, especially its executives, with stock-based compensation. And Amazon's stock has been rising fairly substantially for many years. And so the size of that stock-based compensation is now very large and affords Amazon a large write-off.
Some say the federal government ends up making just as much in the long run from stock-based compensation because the stock is taxed when it's sold. But others have concerns because of the major difference between the value of the stock when it's offered to employees versus the value when it's written off.
They give executives the right to purchase a certain number of shares of stock at a set price. The price of the stock goes way up. The company is then allowed to write off the value of that stock, and suddenly the tax breaks can be huge.
While Amazon did not pay any in federal income tax, they did, however, pay other taxes such as state and local taxes, other federal taxes, and international ones. According to the data from the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, Amazon effectively paid only 3% federal tax rate from 2009 to 2018. But it should have been 35%, just saying. This is not unique only to Amazon, as corporations such as Southwest, GM, and Goldman Sachs have benefited from similar practices. While Amazon was the first corporation to break $1 trillion in value, the first should be even less shocking: Apple. And I say all this as I'm literally recording on my MacBook with all my Apple products, but I know they're kind of trash, y'all. I know, and y'all know it too. While all of y'all are aware of what Apple does and where they operate, the location of their most profitable operations isn't in the US, but in Ireland, where the corporate tax rate is a much lower 15%. And this isn't the first time Apple has done this either, as they have had subsidies in Ireland for the last 30 years. However, this recently came back to bite them because in 2016, with a $13 billion tax bill from the European Commission to be paid to Ireland due to the large amount of state aid Apple received from Ireland. And state aid is pretty much when the national authorities give an advantage on a selective basis to certain corporations. But they don't need any advantages. They have enough coins. Anyways, even more recently, in early 2019, Apple agreed to pay 10 years of back taxes to France, totaling more than $550 million. France is also introducing a GAFA tax, which stands for Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, which would affect tech companies with a global sales of $750 million and $25 million in France. That law would be retroactive to January 1st and expected to raise $500 million this year. Honestly, this is long overdue because these multi-billion-dollar companies aren't above the law and should be equally contributing to their respective countries' economies and not leaving the burden on the lower classes, which is what they're fucking doing. An even bigger atrocity is the pay gap between these huge companies' workers and their CEOs. For many years, working for bigger companies like GM, GE, or Chrysler meant working class families were actually being paid middle class salaries. The biggest factor for this declining over the years is that big companies within different industries pay their workers less than they used to. Varying reasons range from companies not wanting to expand their budgets for employee pay, so they cut their costs, outsourcing to cheaper sources, and because some firms are becoming too large, which means employees have a smaller chance of negotiating for proper wages because there's a smaller chance of abandoning their current employer because there's so many spots to fill. Walmart, the largest private employer with 1.4 million workers, raised their minimum wage to $11 in 2018 and added bonuses for its workers. Obviously, this is a win somewhat, but it doesn't excuse the fact that Walmart's CEO earned $22.8 million that year alone, while the median income of Walmart's employees was $19,177. The wage gap between company CEOs and the lowest earning employee is a huge tragedy and a pure reflection of how our capitalistic society leaves the lower and middle classes out to fend for ourselves. The last corporation I want to focus on is ALEC and their influence in regards to law and policy. ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, is a national policy organization that includes state legislators and corporate representatives that meet together in specific task forces like energy, workers' rights, etc., and write model legislation. Once the model legislation is approved by ALEC's board, the model legislation is then passed on to state representatives to be passed into actual laws. ALEC was a major entity in getting the Stand Your Ground law in Florida passed, which inadvertently led to the shooting of Trayvon Martin, which then led to George Zimmerman being acquitted in his murder. Model ALEC bills that have turned into state policy include states withdrawing from regional climate change initiatives, having no sanctuary cities for illegal immigrants, and in Oklahoma, an individual's ability to bring class action suits against large companies is limited by specifying that class action lawsuits cannot seek any monetary relief. These model bills that are essentially turned into state laws demonstrates the considerable influence ALEC has in state legislators. While some of ALEC's corporate partners like McDonald's, Walmart, and GE all withdrew their support following the criticism they received once the news broke that ALEC basically wrote Stand Your Ground, it's honestly disheartening that such a tragedy like Trayvon Martin's death was used to propel them to withdraw. They shouldn't have been supporters of this organization to begin with. While these companies have continued to influence our economies, policies, and other resources, a plan that Elizabeth Warren, Democratic presidential hopeful, hopes to change this. She wants to impose new rules on certain kinds of tech companies with $25 billion or more in annual revenue, which would force Amazon and Google to spin off parts of their companies and relinquish their overwhelming control over online commerce. The plan also aims to unwind some of the highest profile mergers in the industry, like the combinations of Amazon and Whole Foods, Google and DoubleClick, as well as Amazon's acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp. One of the most impactful things I believe she wants to do in regards to breaking up these big tech corporations is by requiring that 40% of these big companies' corporate boards are composed of companies' workers. By doing this, big shot CEOs and their partners won't be the only ones calling the shots in regards to wages, benefits, day-to-day employee life, and the overall labor load on these employees. Ultimately, what we have to do is continuously push back on these big name companies and their very apparent influence they have in Washington and across state lines. In no way should these few people have such powerful impact on how day-to-day policies are written that would positively impact them and negatively impact the rest of us. Our country has long prided itself on being a country of equal opportunity and liberty for all. But for years and years, that opportunity and liberty has been narrowly limited to the few elite.
And you didn't disappoint, I will tell you, at least from my perspective, in terms of inundating us with content and then giving a lot of the specifics the investment community has been clamoring for. But let me just start with the big picture, if I can, Bob, which is you clearly are pointing in a different direction for this company in terms of the way it goes about distributing the amazing content that you create here at Disney. Why is that something that you feel is necessary to do, and necessary to do in such a significant way as you detailed today?
Well, I think you have to look at not only the way the world is going, but we had to assess what the biggest opportunity was for the company to grow over the long term. And clearly, consumers are enjoying a kind of a different form of entertainment in the home, one that is over the top, not necessarily connected to a traditional satellite or cable distributor or distribution model, one that has a significant amount of choice, one that enables the consumer to customize or to have personalized experiences, one that can be watched seamlessly on multiple devices. And so it was clear that given the company's ability to create content that people love, why not give people content that they love, but on platforms that are becoming more and more interesting to them, more and more compelling to them.
And that's not even all of the tea I have to tell y'all. I also want to touch on how major media conglomerates control what our culture consumes. Corporate overreach goes far beyond the big tech companies we talked about earlier, and privacy issues are another big drawback of these companies gaining more power, which we're going to talk about in a later episode. And major financial institutions like the big banks are also to blame for corporate greed consistently taking advantage of working class Americans. Big media companies are also something I want to highlight specifically in relation to Trey's field of study and how they have enormous influence over what we see on a day-to-day basis. Many of them have been slowly violating antitrust laws in this country for years. Essentially, all of the major content production distributors are owned by major media conglomerates. Some of your favorite networks and movie studios are owned by major corporations seeking to shape what you consume and how you perceive the world based on for-profit interests. For example, NBC and Universal Studios are both owned by Comcast. Paramount Pictures is owned by Viacom, and AT&T just recently purchased Time Warner, which runs both Warner Brothers Studios and HBO. This is particularly concerning because being a big tech company itself, AT&T will soon have access to key platforms with which to promote their products and tap into bigger viewer data, which encroaches upon our individual privacy rights. Other big tech companies are now also breaking into content distribution in order to profit off of our consistent need to watch. Apple unveiled its first streaming service, as well as its own form of banking. Amazon now has Prime Video, and Disney just announced its newest service, Disney Plus, to be unveiled in November of this year to rival streaming giants like Netflix and Hulu. These ownership patterns are concerning because it dilutes what you see to something only a few at the top have control of, which limits true creative expression and authentic media narratives. But being extremely productive from a business perspective depends on how you see this. It also produces an ethical question. When will it be enough for one business? Complete monopolization and control over a specific industry? Doesn't this inherently limit capitalistic freedoms smaller businesses should have to compete? How much is enough? Corporate responsibility is something that is becoming increasingly popular, but unfortunately it's only implemented to heighten positive brand reception rather than implemented from an ethical sense of responsibility. I mean, as long as someone is holding them accountable, which is currently not happening. A specific case study on the Walt Disney Company as a major example of this blatant corporate excess. Recently, the U.S. government allowed Disney to purchase the entertainment segment of 21st Century Fox. Originally owned by the conservative Murdoch family, these entertainment holdings have allowed Disney to own a majority of the theatrical box office for the entire country, as well as a majority stake in the once equally shared Hulu streaming service. This also allows Disney access to an embarrassment of riches when it comes to Fox content for displaying on their own service. This merger, a horizontal one, infringes on U.S. antitrust legislation by essentially monopolizing the film and entertainment business, as well as particularly violating antitrust legislation enacted through the Paramount Accords of 1948. If you're unfamiliar, the Accords targeted the major Hollywood studios of the time because they had complete control over the creative process, controlling all aspects of content release, like production, distribution, and exhibition. Since these studios own a majority of the theater chains that people were going to, they were limiting fair competitions for smaller distributors. Disney, among major media conglomerates as well, are encroaching on this due to strong vertical integration, which once again controls all aspects of the process: production, distribution, and exhibition. Except this time, exhibition comes in the form of rights streaming services. So, this horizontal integration of Fox and Disney, blended with Disney's stronger and stronger vertical monopoly, infringes on antitrust laws. Disney is also super guilty in underpaying its workers, which CEO Robert Iger recently called out via Twitter by Walt Disney's own great niece, Abigail Disney, citing the need for greater corporate responsibility and humane capitalism, which mirrors Elizabeth Warren's plan. Abigail commends Iger for all of the incredible work and success he has brought to the Walt Disney Company, but calls for stronger action in making sure Disney's workers literally aren't homeless and can feed and clothe themselves. Iger specifically earned $65.6 million in total compensation during the company's 2018 fiscal year. So, like I said, all of these issues are not just confined to one industry, but resonate across major corporations in all fields. Holding these companies accountable by emphasizing the need for responsible, ethical capitalism, as well as local and smaller businesses, will allow us all to thrive, rather than the people at the top getting all the coins. Period. I hope that this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listened and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that the failure our government continuously has in regards to controlling how the rich and the powerful influence our way of living prompts you to do the research in how we're being disregarded and then vote those people out who keep letting it happen. Voting isn't the only thing we should be doing, though. We should be organizing, actively participating in our communities to help educate those around us, volunteering, and so much more to get these people the fuck out of the office. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Lenico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French.